It was a cold, quiet night in the small town of Whispering Pines. The town had always been a place where nothing much happened. Nestled in the dense forests of New England, it was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, and the biggest event of the year was the annual Harvest Festival. But that night, as the clock ticked closer to midnight, something sinister was brewing. Lisa Reynolds was alone in the dimly lit office of the Whispering Pines Emergency Dispatch Center. She had been working the night shift for years, and the monotony of the job had long since worn her down. The nights were usually quiet, with the occasional call about a deer in the road or a noise complaint from one of the town's few bars. But that night, the silence was different. It was heavy, oppressive, as if the darkness outside was pressing in on the small building. She had just taken a sip of her lukewarm coffee when the phone rang. The sound was jarring, cutting through the silence like a knife. Lisa set her cup down and reached for the receiver, her hand trembling slightly. Whispering Pines Emergency Services, what's your emergency? For a moment, there was nothing. Just silence. Then, she heard it, a faint, muffled sobbing. Hello? Can you hear me? Lisa asked, her voice tinged with concern. The sobbing continued, growing louder, more desperate. Then, finally, a voice came through. It was weak, trembling with fear. Help me, please, he's coming. Lisa's heart skipped a beat. Ma'am, I need you to stay calm. Can you tell me where you are? There was a pause, followed by a shaky breath. I'm in the old Blackwood house, please hurry, he's coming. The Blackwood house. The name sent a chill down Lisa's spine. The old mansion on the outskirts of town had been abandoned for years, ever since the tragic death of its last owner, Harold Blackwood. The townspeople said the house was cursed, that something evil lurked within its walls. But those were just stories, weren't they? Ma'am, I'm dispatching an officer to your location right now. Stay on the line with me, okay? Can you tell me who is coming? Who is after you? The line crackled, and the woman's voice grew more frantic. It's him, the man, he has no face, oh God, he's here. There was a loud crash, followed by a scream that made Lisa's blood run cold. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the line went dead. Lisa's hands were shaking as she fumbled to dispatch Officer Mike Carter, the only officer on duty that night, to the Blackwood house. As she did, a cold dread settled over her. This wasn't just another prank call. Something was very wrong. Officer Mike Carter had been with the Whispering Pines Police Department for nearly 20 years. He had seen his share of strange things, but nothing had ever rattled him like the call he had just received from Lisa. The Blackwood house. Everyone in town knew the stories, the whispers of strange happenings, of people who had gone in and never come out. But Mike wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. He was a man of logic and reason, and he intended to prove that this was just another case of a trespasser in an old, abandoned house. The drive to the mansion was short, but as Mike turned onto the narrow, tree-lined road that led to the house, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in his gut. The trees seemed to close in around him, their branches twisting and curling like skeletal fingers. The headlights of his patrol car barely pierced the darkness, and the old house loomed ahead like a specter in the night. He pulled up to the front of the mansion, his headlights casting long, eerie shadows across the overgrown lawn. The house was even more imposing up close. Its once grand exterior was now cracked and crumbling, with ivy creeping up the walls like a cancer. The windows were dark, the front door slightly ajar, swaying in the cold night breeze. Mike stepped out of his car, his breath misting in the air. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl. He reached for his flashlight and drew his gun, his instincts telling him to be prepared for anything. He approached the front door cautiously, shining his flashlight into the dark interior. The house was still, the only sound the creak of the floorboards under his boots. Whispering Pines Police, he called out. Is anyone here? There was no response, just the hollow echo of his voice bouncing off the walls. Mike stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. The old mansion was a maze of narrow hallways and grand, empty rooms, all of them shrouded in shadows. As he made his way deeper into the house, the temperature seemed to drop, the air growing colder with each step. Mike's breath came out in white puffs, and a deep sense of unease settled over him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He turned a corner and found himself in what had once been a grand parlor. The walls were lined with dusty, decaying portraits, their eyes following him as he moved. The furniture was covered in white sheets, giving the room the eerie appearance of a tomb. "Hello?" he called out again, his voice wavering slightly. "Is anyone here?" Then he heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound. It was coming from the far end of the room, from behind a large, ornate door that led to the basement. The door was slightly ajar, and from the darkness beyond, Mike could hear the sound of something moving, something wet and slithering. He approached the door slowly, every instinct in his body screaming at him to turn back. But he couldn't. He had to find out what was happening, who had made that call. He pushed the door open with the barrel of his gun and shined his flashlight into the darkness. The stairs leading down to the basement were steep and narrow, the wood creaking ominously under his weight as he did. The air down here was even colder, damp and thick with the scent of rot. At the bottom of the stairs, the basement opened up into a large, cavernous space. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old, rusted tools and dusty jars filled with who knew what. But it was what lay in the center of the room that made Mike's blood run cold. A large, circular hole had been dug into the earth, the edges lined with rough, jagged stones. The hole was deep, so deep that his flashlight couldn't reach the bottom. But he could hear something down there, something moving, something alive. As he stepped closer to the edge, he saw it, a hand, pale and thin, reaching up from the darkness, followed by another, and then another. The hands clawed at the sides of the hole, pulling up bodies, twisted, emaciated figures with hollow eyes and gaping mouths. They crawled out of the darkness, their movements jerky and unnatural, like puppets on strings. Mike stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of nightmare. But the figures kept coming, dragging themselves out of the hole, their bony fingers reaching for him. And then he saw it, the thing that had no face. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body a twisted mass of shadows and tendrils. Where its face should have been, there was nothing, just a smooth, featureless void. It moved towards him with an unnatural speed, and Mike turned to run. But the figures had already surrounded him, their cold, bony hands grabbing at his legs, pulling him down to the ground. He screamed, the sound echoing through the empty house, but there was no one to hear him. The next morning, Lisa sat at her desk, staring at the blinking cursor on her computer screen. She hadn't slept at all, her mind racing with thoughts of the call from the night before. Officer Carter hadn't reported back, and no one had been able to reach him. The police chief had already dispatched a search team, but Lisa knew deep down that something terrible had happened. As she sat there, trying to make sense of it all, the phone rang again. She jumped, her heart racing, and hesitated for a moment before picking it up. Whispering Pines Emergency Services, what's your emergency? There was silence on the other end, followed by a faint, static-filled voice. Lisa, help me. Her blood ran cold. It was Officer Carter's voice. Mike? Mike, is that you? Where are you? The voice crackled again, barely audible. The basement, it's in the basement, don't come, it's too late. And then the line went dead. Lisa's hands were shaking as she hung up the phone. She knew she should call for help, tell someone what she had just heard. But something compelled her to go to the Blackwood house herself, to find out what had happened to Officer Carter. She grabbed her coat and keys and left the office, her mind racing with fear and determination. She had to know the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. The drive to the Blackwood house was a blur. When she arrived, the sight of Officer Carter's patrol car parked in front of the mansion sent a jolt of fear through her. She parked her car next to his and stepped out, the cold air biting at her skin. The front door of the mansion was still ajar, just as Mike had described. Lisa hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open and stepped inside. The house was silent, the air heavy with the same oppressive darkness that Mike had felt. Lisa's flashlight cut through the gloom as she made her way through the grand parlor and down the hallway, towards the basement door. She stopped in front of the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the same cold dread that Mike had felt, the same sense that something was watching her, waiting for her. But she had to know. She had to find out what had happened. She pushed the door open and descended the stairs, the wood creaking under her weight. The basement was just as Mike had described it, dark and cold, the air thick with the scent of rot. And then she saw it, the hole in the center of the room, the same hole that Mike had described. But it was empty now, just a dark, gaping void in the earth. Lisa stepped closer, her flashlight flickering as she shined it into the darkness. There was nothing there, no sign of the figures that Mike had seen, no sign of the faceless man. But then, from the darkness of the hole, she heard it, a faint, whispering voice, calling her name. Lisa. Lisa. She stumbled back, her heart racing, and turned to run. But before she could reach the stairs, the basement door slammed shut with a deafening crash, plunging the room into darkness. Lisa screamed, the sound echoing through the empty house, but there was no one to hear her. 2 weeks later, the residents of Whispering Pines gathered for the funeral of Officer Mike Carter. His body had never been found, but the town had mourned him as if he had been a member of their own family. The loss was felt deeply, especially by Lisa, who had been the last person to speak to him before his disappearance. Lisa had returned to work at the emergency dispatch center, but she was never the same. The nights were filled with terror, with the memory of that final call haunting her every waking moment. She knew that something evil had taken Mike, something that lurked in the shadows of the Blackwood house. One night, as she sat alone in the office, the phone rang again. Lisa's hand trembled as she reached for the receiver, a cold dread settling over her. Whispering Pines Emergency Services, what's your emergency? There was silence on the other end, followed by a faint, static-filled voice. Lisa, he's here, it's too late. It was her own voice. Lisa's blood ran cold as the line went dead, the phone slipping from her hand. She knew what was coming, knew that there was no escaping it. The last thing she heard was the sound of the door creaking open behind her, and the soft, echoing footsteps of the faceless man. The town of Whispering Pines never saw Lisa again. The emergency dispatch center was found empty the next morning, the phone still off the hook, the chair at her desk overturned. The Blackwood house was eventually demolished, the land left to be reclaimed by the forest. But some say that on cold, quiet nights, if you listen closely, you can still hear the faint sound of a phone ringing, and the whisper of a voice calling for help from beyond the grave.